Well, it is indeed an honor to welcome Philip Yancey to this evening's Veritas Forum event. I first became aware of his writing through Christianity Today, where he's an editor-at-large, and through a book called What's So Amazing About Grace, which was given to me by some close friends. Since then, I've read several more of his books and given away copies of it. His words have spoken to me, to my heart, in ways that few other authors have been capable of doing, especially during difficult times. He shares his pilgrimage through life transparently and compassionately with a vast audience of readers. Philip is a prolific author. 6 of his books have won Golden Medallion Awards. And Billy Graham has said of him that there is no other writer in the evangelical world that I admire and appreciate more. A quick search last night on Amazon.com produced 27 titles that he has authored or co-authored. And I suspect there are others that may be out of print that I missed from that list. And there are more than 13 million copies in print, some of which have been translated into other languages. I intend to read some more of his books, so it looks like I have my work cut out for me. In addition to writing essays and books, he also serves as co-chair for the editorial board for Books and Culture. We're very grateful that you've come to UCSB tonight to speak to us on rumors of a hidden world. Let's welcome Mr. Yancey to the podium.
Good evening. I'm impressed. You could be seeing Outfoxed. Maybe you thought this was a theater that was showing Outfoxed. You could be watching Major League Baseball, and instead you came to a Veritas Forum. No baseball tonight? Rained out. Oh, that explains this crowd. Okay. All right. I heard one time from a professor who wrote an essay question for the final exam. And the essay question, I think it was a philosophy class. The essay question was, if I had only 1 hour left to live, I would, and just a blank page. And so he took the papers home, and he was sitting at home grading the papers that night. And he could tell some of the students were obviously just kind of brown-nosing him. You know, if I had 1 hour left to live, I would read Shakespeare and listen to Mozart. Kind of answer you expect a good grade for. But he's reading, and he says, "Oh, listen to this, honey," talking to his wife. He said, "This student really got it. This student is so insightful. They understood what I've been trying to communicate." Because it says, if I had 1 hour left to live, I would spend it in your class. She said, "Let me see that." And she took the paper, and her vision was a little better than his. And she noticed there was an asterisk. And it said, if I had 1 hour left to live, I would spend it in your class. And the asterisk said, "Please turn over." She turned it over. It would seem like eternity. Well, I don't know how you feel about coming to a group that's advertised as religious in nature. I don't know if you feel nervous, defensive. I probably would have at your age, in your place. I went to a Christian college, and we had chapel every day. And you could always find me because I was sitting there reading Time magazine. That's when I read Time magazine. And the deans would call me in on this, and they would say, "Now, Philip, I noticed that you're reading Time magazine during chapel." I said, "Yes, sir." "Well, you should be listening." I said, "Well, sir, I've mastered multitasking. I can actually read the magazine and listen to chapel at the same time." And they'd think about that, and they'd say, "Well, don't you think that's disrespectful for the people who are speaking?" And I would say, "Well, I'd be glad to go up and introduce myself beforehand and explain my multitasking abilities to them." The kind of student that deans hate. And that's kind of how I felt about any organized group where somebody stood up and talked about God. Nervous, defensive, maybe a little guilty, slightly curious, but it takes some courage. It takes some courage in this society especially to think about ultimate questions, to show up, to go see something called Veritas rather than outfoxed. So I'm glad you came. I want you to relax. Nobody's going to yell at you. Nobody's going to preach at you. This is not a debate. There's no one I'm debating with. And I'm not going to try to talk you into something. I'll admit that for much of my life, I hated church. I wrote a book one time with the subtitle, How My Faith Survived the Church. And I got a letter from a pastor who was not happy, and he said, Philip, I get so tired of you complaining about the church you grew up in. I feel like writing a book called How My Church Survived Your Faith. I encouraged him to do that. I thought that would be a very interesting book to read. But most authors really have only one story, one theme that they circle around and talk about from different perspectives. And if I had to summarize my theme, what it would be is this. It would be to survive the worst church imaginable and somehow end up in the loving arms of God. Because the church I grew up in misrepresented God as dearly as it could. For example, my father, when I was just 1 year old, got polio. He was totally paralyzed. He was in an iron lung, could not even breathe on his own. And the people in this church decided that God was going to heal him. So against all the doctor's advice, they removed him from the iron lung. And about a week later, he died. So I have no memories of my father because the church made a mistake in theology. I had a mother who claimed that she had not sinned in 12 years. This is hard for a teenager. How are you going to win an argument with a perfect woman, you know? On all of the major issues of the day, those were the 1950s, early 1960s, our church was on the wrong side. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Its most famous citizen is a man named Martin Luther King. Our church would joke about him. In fact, they called him Martin Lucifer Coon. It was that kind of church, just this mean-spirited, ugly, racist, ungrace-filled place. And my own pilgrimage as a writer has been to go back and try to scrub off those words that were stained, that were polluted, and try to find, is there anything there? So I write books with titles like The Jesus I Never Knew, because I never knew that Jesus growing up in that church. What's so amazing about grace? Because I never encountered grace growing up in church. And if you've been raised under ungrace and suddenly you get a great gulp of grace, it is amazing. It's like nothing else. And my pilgrimage as a person and as a writer has been to go back and reclaim territory. I keep threatening my publisher. I tell him I want to write a book called Lies My Church Told Me. I saw a great movie once called Lies My Father Told Me, and my publisher says, no, Philip, I don't think you ought to write that yet. I said, okay. But I get letters from many people who tell me I'm not alone. I think probably the greatest gamble that God ever took was turning his reputation over to the likes of us. Because if you read church history at all, if you go to a church at all, you realize how unskilled we are at demonstrating what God is truly like. And that's been a struggle for me as it's been for many other people. There was a chaplain a number of years ago, George Buttrick, at Harvard University. And he had a very common experience. Students would come into his office. He had a big, comfortable chair. And they would kind of throw themselves down in this chair and announce, I don't believe in God. And he was quite used to this. Happened almost daily. And he would say this. He would say, well, tell me what kind of God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in him either. And I learned a different kind of God than my church taught me, and I've been kind of in recovery ever since. One thing I learned is that the best way to grasp what God is like is to is to look at Jesus. God gave us Jesus, I believe, as an exact image of what God is like. And if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. In God, there's no un-Jesus-likeness at all. God is like Jesus. One of the things I notice about Jesus is that he never twists arms. He never tries to get people to do things they don't want to do. In fact, he says, you will know the truth, veritas, that's what that word means, and the truth will set you free. And I've come to believe the converse of that statement. If it doesn't set you free, then it's not truth. And the church I grew up in did not set me free, and I concluded that was not truth. But when I look at Jesus, I'm stunned at the kind of person he is. When I wrote the book, The Jesus I Never Knew, I could go through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you could draw a line. The more respectable, good citizen, obedient, responsible a person was, the more threatened they were by Jesus. And the more of a social outcast, the more ungodly, the more irresponsible a person was, the more attracted they were to Jesus. It was kind of the opposite of what we think. And even the stories that Jesus told, the stories always have the wrong person as the hero. He tells a story about the Good Samaritan, not the good Jewish rabbi. He tells the story about the rich man and Lazarus. We don't even know the rich man's name. Jesus doesn't bother to tell us. Lazarus is the hero. He tells the story about the prodigal son. Not the good boy who does everything his father wants, but the guy who squanders it all. And I realized that Jesus came for the losers. Jesus came for the rejects. Jesus came for the social outcasts. Jesus came for me, I concluded. And sometimes when I'm speaking to philosophy students particularly, I say, you certainly have the freedom to reject God, to disbelieve in God. But I am one who believes in God. And one of the things I respect about God is that He gives us that freedom to do that. In fact, I challenge you to find a single argument against God in any of the great agnostics or atheists, Voltaire, Bertrand Russell, David Hume, that is not already included in the Bible. The book of Job, Psalms, Habakkuk, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes. And you can reject God, surely, but I personally have respect for a God that not only allows us to reject Him and even to say He doesn't exist, but who gives us the very words we can use in doing that in His sacred Scripture. That's not a manipulative, arm-twisting, freedom-overruling kind of God. That's a freedom-enhancing, respecting kind of God. Why do I believe, especially coming from a church background like that, why do I believe? Well, I'll be honest with you. One reason I believe is that I haven't found any good alternatives to faith. There's a scene in the Gospels where people are leaving Jesus because He's not an easy person to follow. Don't ever follow Jesus because you think He's going to make your life easier. Jesus makes your life more complicated. Much more complicated. You've got to care about things that it's easier not to care about. Jesus doesn't give you that option. To follow me, you have to care about the kind of people I care about, He says. I can't think of any alternatives, really, to religion. Every society ever studied by anthropologists, sociologists, has a defined religious belief. Now, there are some scientists today who have no religious belief. One of my favorite scientists